So we've been talking a lot about whether or not the external world exists or whether or not that's something that we can prove. And it seems like a really hard question, right? It gets into some deep issues in metaphysics and epistemology. But as you read for today, G.E. Moore actually thinks it's quite easy. Ready? Here's the proof. Here's a hand. Here's another hand. There are two hands. So the external world exists. Mic drop. So we're done. That's the lecture for the day. Just kidding. We're going to go through this proof a bit more carefully, and you guys will see what you think about it. So first, let's recall the argument for Cartesian skepticism that we've been looking at recently. So the argument goes, if I know that I have hands, then I know I am not a brain in a vat. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. So therefore, I don't know that I have hands. We saw that this argument uses modus tollens from the last lecture. That looks like this: if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. But what if we instead reasoned as follows? Same premise as before for number one. If I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. I do know that I have hands. So therefore, I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Why couldn't I just do that instead? And it turns out that this is also a valid argument schema. And it's called modus ponens. It's the cousin of modus tollens. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail. There's a well-known saying in philosophy, which is that one person's modus tollens is another person's modus ponens. So this is what modus ponens look like. That's the argument schema we just saw on the last slide. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. And modus tollens is just same first premise, and then not Q instead of P, so therefore not P. Note that the order of the premises doesn't matter, by the way. You could switch them. So in general, whenever you're presented with an if-then statement, like one of these, then you have two options. The first is to affirm P and thus conclude Q, and that's what you do here for modus ponens. And the second is to affirm not Q, or rather to deny Q, I should have written, and therefore conclude not P. So you can either affirm P, which is the antecedent. There's another lecture on antecedents and necessary and sufficient conditions and stuff, so don't worry about that too much right this second. Or you can deny the consequent. So you can affirm, which is Q. So those are the two options: affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent. You can't do anything else. But take logic if you want to hear more about that. So now we can compare Moore and Descartes' arguments. And Descartes uses modus tollens, or like the standard sort of like Cartesian skepticism argument uses modus tollens. And that looks like this. But Moore is just like, well, why don't I just ponens your tollens? Why can't I just say, like, I know that I have hands, so therefore I know I'm not a brain in a vat? Like, boom, skepticism defeated. Let's all go home. So I want to just take a second and pause and give you an opportunity to practice. If you're already familiar with modus ponens and tollens because you've taken logic or something before, feel free to move a little bit ahead. But I do want you to pause and come up with your own example. This sounds all like fancy and abstract, but it's really not. You use this sort of reasoning all the time in your everyday life. Sorry, I feel like the lighting's really bad in here. We're going to work with it. So let's give an example of modus tollens in action. And this is like a pretty standard type of way of reasoning, right? If there is smoke, then there is fire. There's no fire, so therefore there's no smoke. That's an example of modus tollens. You do this sort of thing all the time without realizing it. And this is just a way to formalize. So I just want you to take 2 minutes, like pause this video and write down your own modus tollens argument. It doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be fun, but just come up with something that seems plausible to you. Like, if there was no coronavirus, then what would you be doing? You're not doing that thing, say. So it is the case that there is coronavirus. No, that's just another example. And now I want you to do the same sort of thing with modus ponens. See if you can take that same argument you wrote and see if you can ponens it instead of tolensing it. So instead of denying the consequent, you're going to affirm the antecedent. And I will correct that previous slide. So see if you can do that with your example, if it's just as plausible. Here we have, if there is smoke, then there is fire, same as before. There is smoke, so there is a fire. So this again is a valid argument schema. Of course, you can try to figure out if it's sound. As always, you can figure out if it's sound by asking if the premises are true. One question to ask is this premise one true in the first place? And this we saw in both of the arguments. So think about whether or not there are any like counterexamples. So counterexamples are cases where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false for these sorts of if-then statements. Again, there's more on this in a different video I will link soon. And arguably there are some counterexamples, like sometimes there's smoke without a fire, right? So think about those. So now let's turn back, after this little interlude, we'll turn back to Moore's proof of an external world. His proof, as I stated at the very beginning of lecture, is here's a hand, here's another hand, there are two hands, so therefore there are external objects. And we'll see in a second how Moore defines external objects, which we haven't seen in this debate. Nobody's really told us what an external object is, and we'll see his definition in a second. And this is just a little meme that I found that's sort of poking fun. Okay, so you might be wondering, how exactly is this a proof? Like, I do math and stuff and no one would ever accept that as a proof. So Moore gives us 3 criteria for a genuine proof, which is quite helpful. The first is that the conclusion must be distinct from the premises. The second is that the premises must be known to be true. And 3, the argument must be valid. So we can assess for Moore's argument whether or not he's given us a genuine proof using his own criteria. But we can also ask whether these criteria are really sufficient for a proof, or if there's anything else that he missed. So let's first go through criteria 1 and 2. So criteria 1, the conclusion must be distinct from the premises, and the answer is yes, that's the case. Because one of the conclusions is that they're external objects that's different from the premise that, like, here's a hand. The premises must be known. I put a little emoji because it's kind of debatable, right? That's sort of what's at issue. Moore considers an objection, which is that you don't know that you have hands actually, so you don't know either of those premises because you have not proven that. And Moore is like, yeah, I accept that I haven't proven it, but I just deny that shows that I don't know it. Like and think about this for yourself. Like, are there things that you know but can't prove, like sort of definitively? So something to think about. But we can also ask, like, so say we agree with Moore that we should reject this assumption. Are there other ways to argue that criteria 2 is not met? And in fact, we have seen an argument for this in the previous lecture, and you'll see one again in the Lewis paper for Tuesday, that there's another way of arguing that the premises in this case are not known. So I encourage you to review that lecture from last time, and we'll talk about it in relation to Lewis on Tuesday too. So we're still like, premise 2, was criterion 2 met? Not sure. So criteria 3, the argument must be valid. So is the argument valid? Well, let's remind ourselves this is the argument. And now we're like, okay, this C1 definitely follows from premises 1 and 2. No one's going to deny that. But what about C2? There are external objects. And one thing that's worth noting, and this was not in your excerpt that you read for today, so don't worry that you missed something, but it is in the full-length piece. Moore says that what it means for an external object to exist is for it to be possible that it like obtains without us perceiving it. So it uses the word experiencing or and perceiving at different points. So we can ask, is it possible for two hands to exist without us perceiving them? Because if not, then he hasn't shown that C2 follows from C1. So that's just something to think about. So now we might ask, are these criteria sufficient for a proof? So in other words, suppose those three criteria we saw are all met. Is there anything further that Moore had to do in order to genuinely give us a proof or an external world? And I suspect a lot of you might feel like Moore is playing a sort of joke on us, like he's trolling us or something like that, because it's just kind of silly. Like if you just went up to anybody and were like, I mean, go, I mean, maybe you're at your parents' house now, but go to a friend, Zoom with a friend, and just be like, hey, I have a proof for the external world. And then you hold up two hands, they'll be like, are you okay? Is this all getting to you? So it's really easy to joke around about Moore's argument. But why? Like, why isn't Moore's argument convincing? Like, what more do we demand from a proof? And Moore is sort of suggesting or telling us that our standards for a proof are way too high. So if the answer is that it wouldn't convince the skeptic, we might ask, well, like, why is this the criteria? Why do we need to convince the skeptic in order for this to be a genuine proof? In other words, why should that be the standard? And instead, maybe it's enough that we've just sort of given ourselves good reason to not fall into the skeptic's trap. So, and this is worth noting because it is how a lot of philosophers think about skepticism today. They don't think about it like something that's worth solving. They just tend to treat skepticism as a quote unquote a disease of the mind, to use a metaphor from Timothy Williamson. And perhaps just by way of analogy, Moore's proof is just trying to help us not contract this disease, but it's not a cure or a panacea for it. So this is just sort of like food for thought. Like, what should our standard be? Should we be able to convince the skeptic? Like, that's not going to be able to, that's not going to happen. That's not possible. So if we lower our standards, then is Moore's proof actually a good one? So that concludes our lecture for today, except I forgot about my last picture. When someone says Moorean facts are dumb, but you know the conclusion, Moorean facts aren't dumb, better than any premise. Yeah. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture and something to think about. Well, the good news is you do in fact have hands, maybe.